That about says it all. Annie Hall, The Sorrow and the Pity, and Last Tango in Paris are among the best movies Roger and I saw during the 1970s. And best films of the 70s is the topic we'll be exploring this time on Sneak Previews Take 2, one of those special change of pace shows where Roger and I take a look at trends and issues in the movies. And this is Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune. And we have both seen a lot of movies during the last 10 years. What would you say, Gene? Maybe 300 a year would be about 3,000, give or take a couple of movies. And at some point during the decade, I realized that what makes a movie great is not its message or its philosophy, but its immediate human experience and the texture of that experience. Let me take a minute to explain what that means. Movies aren't usually very good at arguing abstract ideas, but what a good movie can do, better than any other art form, I think, is create and reflect emotion. And when we go to most movies, say 98 out of 100, we remain aware that we're sitting there in the theater, we're watching a movie, but sometimes, a few times a year, we grow so absorbed in the experience of a movie that we literally forget ourselves. It's sort of an out-of-the-body experience. We seem to be actually sharing the identities and experiences of the characters in the movie. And in other words, the movie seems to be happening to us. We're not watching it, we're living it. And that strong, vivid, emotional experience is what a lot of my favorite movies of the past decade have in common.
Well, I have a theory too, Roger, about what makes a great movie, but before I explain mine, let's take a look at one of the decade's greatest films that illustrates my theory. It's Bernardo Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, in which a middle-aged American widower, bitter over his wife's suicide, picks up a young, free-spirited, hippie-type Parisian girl and tries to create a world in which he can dominate her and not be hurt himself. A world in a vacant apartment, a world without names, just the two of them, Marlon Brando and Maria Schneider. A powerful scene. To me, that's a real encounter. Brando's anger comes out of his outrage at the unfairness of life, at his frustration at growing old and at being alone. Last Tango in Paris is a whole world of anger, expressed verbally and sexually, a world as real and as powerful as any I've ever experienced. This is one of my theories of what makes a great film. I like movies that are complete unto themselves, seamless, movies that draw us up to the screen, make us forget that we're sitting in a movie theater seat, movies full of characters that can be discussed like we might discuss members of our own family. I like movies that create a complete world, that you can talk about them after you leave the theater.
Well, we could do that right now. I certainly know what you mean about the world that's created in Last Tango in Paris, which has got to have one of Marlon Brando's greatest performances. And the world that he's trying to create for himself and for Maria Schneider, the world that shuts out the outside, the pain and the hurt that he feels about the fact that his wife has died, is so real, and he is so real there that he's about as real as anybody I know in real life.
Yes.
It's somebody you can talk about how he would behave, how he would react. My first choice for one of the best films of the 1970s is a movie I think is going to influence a lot of films in the 1980s. It's Paul Mazursky's An Unmarried Woman, with Jill Clayburgh as a New Yorker who thinks she's happily married until her husband breaks down in tears on the street one day and tells her all about the girl he fell in love with in the shirt department of Bloomingdale's. Well, at first, Clayburgh can't believe it. How could her perfect marriage be falling apart without any warning? She goes through a period of deep depression, and then in this scene, her woman friends and her daughter rally around her. They're having their problems with self-esteem, too. I think that scene is about how fantasy ideas about women are at odds with the way this one unmarried woman, played by Jill Clayburgh, really is. The director, Paul Mazursky, started with an intellectual and political viewpoint about women, and then he told a story that communicated his ideas and human emotions. So we got a long, hard look at what the Jill Clayburgh character thinks about herself, her husband, her daughter, her life, and most especially what it is she wants to do next. At the end of a decade when we got a lot of dumb, stupid, vicious, sexist portraits of women, this was a movie that took us out of ourselves and, at least in my case, allowed me into this particular woman's world.
You know, this film almost could be viewed as a primer on what American women are really like.
It's good. Yeah.
The problem is that if it didn't have those quiet scenes, like with that woman crying, it sort of been a boring lecture. But because of those good scenes, we really buy this film. I've always said that the great movies take us to worlds we've never been before. It applies here to women as they live. We've never been to that world, or haven't been to that world in a long, long time in American movies. An excellent film. If my theory is that a great film creates a whole world and that the great directors are almost godlike in their abilities to create such worlds, Then director Marcel Ophuls' epic documentary, The Sorrow and the Pity, certainly qualifies as one of the greatest films ever made. The film is a documentary about the way French people conducted themselves during the German occupation of France during World War II. Some people cooperated with the Germans. Others resisted. Some people turned in their Jewish neighbors. Some looked the other way. And some Jews said they were not Jews, all in an effort to survive. Now, in one of the film's most compelling sequences, director Ophuls took his camera crew to a French village and interviewed a shopkeeper who took out an ad in a newspaper during the war saying that he was not Jewish. I don't know if he was Jewish or not, and that isn't the point. The Sorrow and the Pity simply investigates how people really act under pressure. Ophuls, the director, serves as sort of an archaeologist of human frailties and courage as he reveals what his fellow countrymen did to themselves and to each other, all in the name of survival at one significant period in history. The Sorrow and the Pity is a film that doesn't so much create a world as much as it recreates a lost world. You know, we regularly get movies where writers try to dream up the way characters act. Well, here's a film where the filmmaker, through a lot of hard work and tough interviews, revealed the way people really do act. You know, this film caused a tremendous scandal in France when it first came out in the early 70s. People didn't want to see what he was going to show them the way they were 30 years ago.
Yeah, especially since it wasn't a fiction film, it was factual. And this is, I guess, the only documentary we have on our list of the best films of the 70s. I agree with you, it's one of the great films of the 70s. What's neat is that although, as you mentioned, the director is dealing with real people, real places, and so forth, what makes the film unique is his imagination. Still, the way he orders this material and the angle that he has on it and the way he invites us into it makes it a very special film.
Yes.
And my next film is also about a war, as a matter of fact, Vietnam, and our national nightmares about it. It's Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, one of the most expensive epics ever made, and I think it's also one of the best. The movie centers around an American Army captain's long voyage up a river to find and destroy a mad Army colonel who's become a sort of god in the jungle, kind of a demented deity. And along the way, the captain, played by Martin Sheen, encounters a bizarre lieutenant colonel who treats the war like a child's game. The colonel, Robert Duvall, goes berserk in this scene as he attempts in the heat of battle to take a beach because it looks like a good place for surfing, you know. Duvall has a real scary, crazy quality there. A lot of us by now, I think, having rewritten history, seem to think that everybody was against the war in Vietnam all along, but that scene shows you that a lot of people thought it was a good idea. I think Coppola saw his film as a journey deeper and deeper into our national insanity about Vietnam, and Apocalypse Now has battle footage in it that's somehow terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. There's a helicopter attack on a Vietnamese village, for example, in which Coppola gives us the sensation of actually being under fire. And you know, there's hardly a subject the film doesn't address itself to. It deals with why we fought, how we fought, who fought, and the effect it had on them and on us.
Well, I don't share your opinion. This is one of the great films of the decade. It certainly started out for about half of it being at that level, and then I felt the film sort of fell apart at the end. I'll grant you this, in terms of its catalog of ideas, this film covered more material than any other Viet film of the decade. I just wish that the ending of the picture, as I've said before on the show, had been a lot better. In Annie Hall, which I think is the decade's funniest film, Woody Allen gives us a couple of worlds for sure. The world of New Yorkers who he thinks think too much, and the world of Southern Californians who Woody Allen thinks don't think enough. At the center of the film is an investigation into the nature of love relationships. Must they always be so painful? In Annie Hall, Woody Allen says yes, but he also says the relationships are worth the pain. Some of that pain is evident the very funny but awkward first time Woody Allen meets Diane Keaton after a game of tennis. Well, it's very funny, but, you know, Roger, if you think about it, it's sort of sad that people can't talk to each other directly. Annie Hall is Woody Allen's best film of the decade, I think. Sweet, painful, always very funny. You know, I don't want to beat this into the ground, but here's another filmmaker who's created a whole world, a world in which Woody Allen is our guide. He's a little man, not unlike Charlie Chaplin's little man, who's being poked at by society's frauds and who pokes back at them even harder. A very special film.
I like what you said about Chaplin, because in a way that is what Allen is doing. He's making this world in which we know the rules, and the rules all kind of fit this character, his weaknesses, his insecurities, the way he relates to people.
Yes.
And so there are times in the Woody Allen picture where we know the joke just because of the situation, even if it's not explained to us in the dialogue. It's real nice. I'm not sure, though, that Annie Hall is one of the greatest pictures of the 1970s. I actually think that Allen might turn out to be one of the great directors of the 80s. I think he's still growing as a director.
Then we'll have some very good films.
I hope so. Now, one of my favorite directors is the Italian master filmmaker Federico Fellini. And a lot of Fellini's films have been based on his own life, both on real events and especially on things that he imagines might have happened to him, or maybe that ought to have happened to him. And in a wonderfully comic and nostalgic 1974 movie named Amicord, which is an Italian dialect word for I remember, He went back to his childhood and recreated it even down to the small town he grew up in. And Amarcord is one of the most seductive fantasies I've ever seen. The movie follows its young hero and the other people in his small town through 1 year in the 1930s, and it's a great movie-going experience. And if I had my way, I'd love to show you the whole movie, but what we did was pick the movie's single most beautiful image. That scene has a real, inexplicable, magical quality to it. But you might ask, what does it mean? What does a peacock spreading its tail feathers in the snow have to do with a young man growing up in Mussolini's Italy? And well, you might ask, but I have a notion that if you asked Fellini, he'd only smile, because Amarcord isn't about a real childhood. It's about Fellini's fantasies and dreams, and about the comic tales and bizarre relatives and funny townspeople that he half remembers. People sometimes ask me what my favorite film is, and I never know what to say. But I do know this: Amarcord is one of the best times I've ever had at the movies.
I want to say something about that peacock. It is a gorgeous image in the movies. I think it's beauty appearing when we least expect it. I think we feel melancholy about that. It's perfection at a childhood when we know that childhood wasn't perfect. It's a beautiful scene. You make a point, I think, by picking this film that there was a great master filmmaker, Federico Fellini, who did make a great film in the 70s. Right. So many people have said that the great filmmakers, Fellini, Bergman, Kurosawa, Hitchcock, did not do anything great in the 70s. They did their best films in the 50s and 60s. You did it right this time. Amarcord is one of the great ones. I think so. Another one of the great films of the 70s, and this has been sort of forgotten, is Swedish director Jan Trell's The Immigrants and his sequel, The New Land, both about the settling of the American Midwest by Swedish immigrants in the mid-1800s. The film starts out in Sweden, showing us the tough life, the famine that motivated people to travel by boat to America, the Golden Land. Finally, after incredible hardships traveling on train, horseback, and by foot, it finally comes down to picking a specific piece of land to call one's own home, and every man's choice in this film is a celebration of our land. That's how The Immigrants ends, with a glorious moment, Max von Sydow finding his land. The sequel shows us what his family and friends experience when they stay a while in America, promises filled and unfulfilled. This is an incredible movie project spanning 5 hours. I only wish the history courses I had taken in school had been as vibrant as the history in The Immigrants in the New Land. It's interesting, Roger. You know, it took a filmmaker from Sweden to give us the world of America, as it surely must have existed.
You know, that's what occurred to me. I saw the film in Stockholm just before it was released, and this is a bicentennial present from the Swedes to the Americans. This is a movie that really, in 5 hours, tells us the story of how so many of us came here and the things that we found here and the experiences we had. Hollywood, USA, during that entire 2 years of the bicentennial, didn't really give us anything like this. Maybe Nashville was the closest film that they came to. But my next film is also about the growing up of America, about what happened a century later in the land of opportunity that the Swedes set out to discover. The movie's called Breaking Away, and it was one of the most endearing films of the 1970s. The story of 4 young high school graduates in Bloomington, Indiana, and about how they hung around their hometown and resented what they saw as the easy success of the students at Indiana University, and about their lack of confidence in their own futures. The local kids in the movie are called cutters because many of their fathers were limestone cutters in downstate Indiana. And in this scene, we see a father and son, 2 generations of Bloomington natives, and how they relate to the big university in their small hometown. Dennis Christopher played the young man, and his father there was Paul Dooley in an outstanding supporting performance. Now, we were talking earlier about movies that create their own worlds and invite us into them. And with Breaking Away, I had a different experience, though. That scene with the father and son walking through the campus took me back to my own childhood in Urbana, Illinois, where my father was an electrician who helped to build the University of Illinois campus. And so perhaps one of the things I like about Breaking Away was that it portrayed in America we don't often see on the screen, the world of Middle America, the Midwest, between the coasts. Then there were a lot of scenes in it that really did get us involved in that out-of-the-body sort of way we were talking about. A brilliant sequence, for example, with Dennis Christopher racing his bicycle against a semi-trailer truck, or the sudden terror of swimming in a limestone quarry. Good scenes, a real good movie.
This is probably the most likable film of the decade, I think. I mean, everyone loved this picture. I know a lot of people like that bicycle sequence that you mentioned where we're rooting for the underdogs. What I liked about the film is the clip you showed, where we see that the middle class is really sort of ticked off at its position, the working class, a lot of frustration. The film doesn't back off. The little kid would like his father to feel okay, but the father says, no, I am upset. And that is the way a lot of people feel. The film showed it. A good choice, Roger. And now let's recap Roger and my choices of some of the best films of the 70s, the 8 films we've already showed you scenes from, and also some of our other personal favorites of the decade. I greatly admire Marcel Ophuls' The Sorrow and the Pity, Woody Allen's Annie Hall, Bernardo Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, Jan Trell's The Immigrants in the New Land, The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 of Francis Coppola's The Conversation, Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets, Hal Ashby's The Last Detail, John Badham's Saturday Night Fever, and Claude Chabrol's Les Bouchers.
And my favorite films of the decade are Paul Mazursky's An Unmarried Woman, Francis Coppola's Apocalypse Now, Federico Fellini's Amarcord, Peter Yates's Breaking Away, Robert Altman's Nashville, Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven, Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter, Werner Herzog's Heart of Glass, and Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers. And, of course, Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfathers Part 1 and 2, and the fact that we have that on both of our lists is an indication, I think, that we could each have picked a lot of our other films. Of these 20 films, we both think that they're some of the best films of the last 10 years.
I got a little nostalgic. I realized I started as a film critic in the last months of 1969. This is my life, my professional life on film we just ran through. These are some of the worlds that I've been removed out of my theater seat and taken to on the screen. Very beautiful moments. Sure, we had a lot of junk with a lot of disaster pictures in the 70s. These were some beautiful moments.
You know, I have to agree with you. Looking at those 20 films, even a couple that we disagreed on a little bit, you know what I thought? I wished I had a movie theater. I'd like to throw a film festival
of those films. That would be nice. Well, that's it for this show. Join Roger and me next time for sneak previews. Until then, see you at the movies.